Lamb, the main character narrator in your book, shares that with you.
She does. But, you know, racism is always discussed in the newspaper in such black and white terms. Even then I could see those kids weren't racist. They were curious about different cultures. They just had no encounter with them. So they might study refugees at school. No one ever takes them across the river to visit Footscray or Springvale to see real, people settling in. So it's theoretical.
So there's a kind of political mission that's in the book, but you don't want it political in the sense that you want it to be explicitly and you don't want to be pontificating, do you?
No.
Can story do that? Can story be kind of powerful and cut through in a way that sometimes political positioning can't, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely.
Why is it that story can do that, do you think?
Because everyone relates to narrative, and I read a really wonderful book recently, Helen Garner's latest book, where she sits in court and, it's about the case of the father whose car goes into the river and his 3 boys drown. So she sat through the whole court case for 7 years. For 7 years she turned up at court every day, and I remember there's this tiny, tiny scene in it. It's just 1.5 pages, where one day she sits next to a boy, a really smart boy from a private school who's been sent there to watch court proceedings, and he keeps telling her, he doesn't know she's a writer or anything, his views on how the case is unfolding and what he thinks and how he thinks the witnesses are lying. And because she sat through the whole case, she can see it quite nuanced, and she can tell that bumbling witness, who is a man who, those really country men who aren't good with words, who shake. So this boy is saying that guy's clearly lying, and Helen Garner's seen him for so many, 7 years, doesn't say anything and says, you're very good at, looking at character. Do you think you'll be a detective? And the boy says, oh, no, I'm definitely going to study law. It's just that kind of remove where you train young adults to lead the world and they're so disconnected. Imagine him as a lawyer. So I guess that story illustrates better than if she were to write a diatribe about,
The sociologist Ivan Illich says that if we want to make profound change, we've got to change the story that we tell too.
It's true.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So as a novelist, as a writer, as someone who's writing satire about this imaginary world of these privileged women and comparing it to these kind of Braybrook kind of girls, are you on that mission a little bit? Are you hoping, with all the humility I know you have, Alice, that the book will shake people off their kind of certainty a little bit, will challenge assumptions? Are you hoping that every teacher might read it? Are you hoping that kids who go to a school like that might read it and it might challenge them in some way? Is there a hope of that?
Yeah, I do hope that. I hope it will challenge people in some way. As a writer, I think one of the greatest gifts I've been inadvertently given is a lack of certainty. So I'm filled with self-doubt. I'm always filled with self-doubt. When I was younger, I was filled with low self-esteem. And that, that's a blessing in disguise, because then your work becomes nuanced. It's not full of certainty, because when you're full of absolute certainty, and I've seen, I've grown up with many students who are filled with certainty. I've taught students like that. You're presenting your point of view. You don't let the story speak for itself. When you take yourself out of it, the story unfolds. As a Buddhist, I think there's this saying that says where there's no ego, it's very hard to do. There's no target too. So it's good as a writer. If you don't put your ego into your work, you get criticised for it. You really don't care, because it's just your work. It's not you, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Yeah.
Can we just return to those characters from that Lorinda school? Tell us about the group, the cabinet. Tell us about some of the teachers there and that. And one of the things that struck me as a teacher was that this was very much not a story about teachers and their ability to change or mould people too. It was not. The 2 teachers in the book are kind of lose their heart, and they get clobbered a bit too, don't they?
Oh, yeah, I guess so. So the school is run by a trio of girls called the Cabinet. These are the very wealthy girls. They're quite attractive. They're the smartest girls in the school. And they're only 15 years old. But back in Lorinda is a very old girls' school. And back in the 1800s, It was a finishing school. You know how they had finishing schools. They polished you up and then you were considered to be in the cabinet for eligible young bachelors to check out and open the cabinet and take you for their wives. So that's where this mythology comes from. So now the hierarchy is that the top girls in the school, the top trio, they call themselves a cabinet. They're kind of proud of this sexist tradition, which is very interesting. And they keep the school in line. So they're supported by very wealthy and powerful parents, and when they feel a teacher is slightly vulnerable, and we've all had vulnerable teachers that stutter, teachers that might have a mole somewhere you think is funny on their face, teachers that might have had a deaf in the family and just come to school all shaky. These girls are ruthless because they're taught that they deserve the best education. So they try and play pranks on these teachers till these teachers can't take it anymore. And the administration are kind of, you know, they let these things go because it's hard to fire teachers. So if the girls do it for them, then it keeps their marks up in the school and the school keeps its good reputation.
The spirit of that school, that elusive thing that's talked about a lot in your book, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is really kind of maintained a lot by the students, don't they? No one quite identifies what that spirit is or talks to it, but it's there, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's pulling people into line. There's a uniformity that's really disconcerting in the book. Do you think that's what Marsden meant when he said the book's shocking in that way? Because we look at that world and we go, isn't anyone going to speak up? Isn't anyone going to kind of break this kind of uniformity? Isn't anyone going to kind of, you know, stick up for these vulnerable kind of people in the school?
I guess Marsden did find it shocking in that way because it's a young adult book. Young adult books, people expect to have, a sense of almost a message, but this is kind of reminiscent of the real world. If you get a pernicious element in your workforce, if you get a really bad culture in your workplace, this is exactly what happens. People fall sick, people have nervous breakdowns, people leave. And I just transferred it onto a school.
Sure.
Yeah.
And Mrs. Van der Werp, who's a lovely lady. She's gentle and she really cares about her history and that. But, you know, they kind of get to her, don't they? They kind of perform this prank on her and then she's kind of gone. And then they see it as this act of kind of purifying the school, don't they, you know?
Yeah, because they think she's a bad teacher. But that's what happens when you have students who try and tell that success at all costs is the way to go about it. You create future leaders, you expect them to, take over the world, and there's a certain ruthlessness about that.
And there's no word,
entitlement.
There's no place for frailty or uncertainty in that world.
And you kind of feel sorry for these students.
Yeah. I'm 61 and like you, I still feel that great uncertainty, and every time I go into a classroom, I'm still not sure whether this might be hitting the mark and that. So
me too.
I'd be scared of that brutality done, and to some of those, the teacher, the politics teacher, he's got the Socratic method going. He's got a bit of kind of spunk about him, hasn't he? He wants to try something different, but eventually they kind of wear him down, don't they?
Yeah. It's interesting. You think that groups of girls are powerless. Individually, 15-year-old girl is relatively harmless, but in large groups, sometimes they're not aware of what they're doing. So I went to this Catholic school to give a talk, and their English coordinator was an attractive man who was about 35, 36, and he said, "You'll never believe what the girls did." He was walking up the stairs, and because he was very attractive, he heard a click behind him, and they had their camera phones and were taking pictures of his bum. And he looked behind him and he said, "You stop that, you erase that right now." And he was so scared, because if they circulated these pictures, parents would say, "What's that teacher doing posing for the students?" So he was so scared for himself, So he said, these girls don't know what they're doing. They have no idea with their camera phones and their little crushes. And he said if it happened at a boys' school, if some boys were taking pictures of a female teacher's bum, they would be suspended. It's harassment. But because it was him, the staff said, "Oh, look, it's just these girls." But he said, "I could lose my job with these girls." Yeah.
are you trying to say that this is somehow a larger metaphor for the world we live in? Are we, as a society, less able to speak up, even though we live in a democracy? Do you think there's more conformity?
I don't think there's a metaphor for anything.
You don't?
I'm not stretching it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Tell us about if you heard young people discussing your book. What would be the kinds of things that you'd like to think that they were kind of seeing in the book? And what do you think are some of the themes that are there, apart from uniformity and apart from this kind of secret collaboration to create this kind of spirit? What are some of the other themes going on in the book?
Well, there's always... We have this quite extroverted culture for young people now, where to be a leader you have to know how to speak properly and you have to speak up whenever you see injustice. But one of the good ways to combat injustice, which probably our culture doesn't speak about often enough, is you can be a silent resistor. So if you're the new girl at school, there's no way you can go and speak up and rally up troops. And the way Lucy does it is she just silently resists. She refuses to cooperate. She spends time she takes herself away from everyone at school and just sequesters herself in the library. And that's all she does. She doesn't do anything else.
And she looks at art books a lot in the library, doesn't she?
She looks at art books. And I don't think that's a sign of cowardice. Okay. I think it's a sign of resilience. Aung San Suu Kyi, who spent many years in house arrest, had the same philosophies as well. Yeah, you can resist silently.
Is there a little bit of Alice at school who did that? The library and the refuge of the library and a place to pull back away from the world?
Oh, well, I had a group of friends at school who went to the library with me, and they worked very hard. So at home, one of my friends sewed, one worked at a restaurant with her parents, and one looked after her nieces and nephews while her sister's husband drove a taxi. So we do our homework in the library, and the best thing was, because we're all migrant students, the librarians loved us. They said, look at these, Asians and Turkish students. They're so hardworking. They work in the library all the time. But it was because sometimes we didn't finish our homework at home. We had other things on. So, yeah, I like libraries, yeah.
There's a moment in the book where Lucy and her father both share that same disillusionment, because Lucy's in this school, Lorinda, and she realises that I believe that educated people were gentler and kinder than the uncouth, unlearned masses, but now I wasn't so sure. If education doesn't bring about a kind of a compassionate, broader awareness, if it doesn't do that, then it's a shocking thing, isn't it? And can you understand her kind of disillusionment at seeing the people who had most access to these books, to literature, and yet none of that literature seemed to inform the way they lived or generated any kind of spontaneity in them? It was like it was literature but it was separate from their living.
Life. Yeah, I felt like that a lot at school. Yeah. So at one school we studied the classics, we studied Fitzgerald, we studied, Patrick White, and that felt very removed, and those students were studying this literature and they were forming the most enlightened views. They were, having debates about politics, and yet it just all seemed so theoretical. And the heartbreaking thing were these students knew how to talk, so they'd be the future leaders and they'd be making policies and decisions that affected my friends in Braybrook and Footscray, who had very rich lives, but had no voices because they didn't have access to that kind of education, that kind of way of speaking. It's a different language. As a lawyer, Tim Costello says that the law locks people out deliberately, because if the law was simplified, anyone could do their own conveyancing, anyone could go to court and represent themselves. It's quite simple. As a lawyer myself, I'm saying you could do these things.
I think for me personally, one of the most beautiful moments in the book, and I'm a bit of I don't have a whole sense of books, but there's just little moments and I just kind of go for them and they kind of stay with me. And it's a scene between Lucy Lamb and her mum and Mrs. Lamb. I never tell them about our lives. You know why? It's not because I'm ashamed. It is because some things are just good, too good to be judged. how did you get to that scene and that beautiful moment with this woman who is living in this cluttered garage and living this high-pressured existence of cutting these fabrics and getting shitty pay and, you know, the most unbearable kind of pressure that she's under, and she's raising a little tacker, and Lucy's off at this prestigious school. Was that an important moment in the book for you?
I think it was, because, these families, these migrant families, work so hard because there's this idea of hope at the end that you'd get a house and land package in Caroline Springs, that your kids would go to university. That's what they work towards, and that's what keeps them going. This idea, this great Australian dream, is literal to a lot of migrant families. And when you come from the western suburbs, you can see the big difference it makes to have this literal interpretation of the dream, because some of my friends are maybe second-generation welfare friends, you know, that their parents weren't at work, and they were so disillusioned and it wasn't their fault. It was just generations of joblessness, and that they didn't understand this idea of hope. There was this Great Depression among them, which was heartbreaking, that you generally, you know, because migrant families push you so hard, if you're depressed, you push through that, I guess.
Schools a lot, as we talked about before. I think in the book you kind of go, these privileged girls are forever hearing these great kind of erudite minds talking about leadership, and you give this sense you can listen to 1,000 kind of lectures about leadership, but it won't necessarily kind of do anything for you. But I get a sense when you write your non-fiction and you wrote a piece called It's Time to Embrace the F Word in 2007, you go, but when I speak directly to high school students, they are curious because they are braver and more resourceful than our society gives them credit for. Students realise that if we don't learn to have a good relationship with failure, but are just taught to doggedly work at success, then the terrible fear comes in, the fear of losing, the anxiety about not attaining, the conviction that your best is never good enough. Your role as a counsellor, your role as a mentor, your role in Janet Clark Hall, you care about young people and what they think. Are you optimistic about our world in the care of these young people that you see? Do you think they're going to kind of cut through some of the kind of the pretentiousness of the Lorinda School and see the world kind of in daring and courageous kind of ways?
I think so, Bruno, but Janet Clark Hall is quite special because the principal is quite a special man. So he's been there for 10 years and he's turned the college around. About 50% of our students are on scholarships who otherwise wouldn't be there. That's a huge percentage, 93 students, 50% on, you know, the scholarships could be small, cover their books, or it could cover most things about their education. And also he knows that these students are the most, when they, you know, some of them are from the countryside, some are from overseas. He says when you reach university, your life is so different from any, you know, you're in a privileged position. So he's not interested about what careers they'll do or, you know, what successes they'll achieve. He's interested in what kind of people they'll be. And this is reflected in his staff. So this year there have been 4 babies born in the college who live there with us. It's a very, you know, most people, if you're going to have babies in the college, they reconsider your contract. There's no, it's part of life. It's part of being an educator. You work and you have children, you know.
So you can take a place like Janet Clark Hall that might look to have all the vestiges of privilege, and you can really do some good stuff. You can,
yeah. And you can choose the students. You don't have to choose the very privileged, wealthy ones. You can go out in the countryside and find students. So Nick came from the countryside. We met 10 years ago at Janet Clark Hall.
He was one of your students, wasn't he?
He was. Yeah. And I guess part of my role as author in residence, I visit a lot of country schools, is to encourage the students that might not otherwise go to university to come, because they'll have a very good place where they'll be supported. We understand a student who goes to university needs the support and mentor if they're the first in their family to go to university. Some colleges will have these equal access programs, some schools, so they'll have like Indigenous students or Sudanese students. And I remember giving a talk in a high school a very private all-girls school, interstate, and the teacher had heard me once before, and I was talking about my last book, Her Father's Daughter, which is about my dad surviving the killing fields in Cambodia. And I had these slides that I put up of skulls, just pictures of nothing bloody, and just a few other slides. You would have seen these pictures in the Nazi Holocaust, in the Cambodian context. And the teacher, just as I plugged my USB in, she took me aside, she said, I don't think you should show these slides. Just talk about the Holocaust, but don't tell. I don't think the girls are ready to see. It might be a bit confronting. And I looked at the audience, 200 girls. They were fine, But I saw one student there, this Sudanese scholarship student they were so proud of, and I thought, you're not letting me show slides of what happens in the real world. How do you relate to this black girl that you've taken on in the school if you don't acknowledge her history, which is a history of killing fields, in Sudan? So that was such a paradox. It was so strange.
Alice, you changed about 5 schools yourself. I'm not going to go into that.
Yeah.
But every time I've heard you talk, there's always a sense that you kind of you care about what teachers do, and you kind of think the teachers can do good things too. So even though your book, Lorinda's often about some teachers there that kind of, as I said, lose their way, you're a big rap for teachers. What do teachers do well when they do it well, and what are they doing?
Oh, well, when they do well, they create someone like me. They've given me every opportunity. I mean, the cultural capital which I have, the reading, everything came from my teachers. Because my household, we speak a different language, We everything's different in a migrant household. So the way I operate in the world is because my teachers have given me these tools that I hopefully put to good use. So I'm so grateful to the teachers in my life.
You're going to hate me doing this because I'm going to lead with some really big. William Golding, Lord of the Flies, he won the big prize. What's the big prize in literature called? The
Man Booker.
Even the bigger one than that.
Pulitzer.
Even bigger than that. The
Nobel
Prize. He won it way back in the 80s. And he says of the novel, and I'm paraphrasing, he goes, no other art form gets inside a character, stays with a character as profoundly as a novel does. Is that for you the great joy of novel writing and writing about that you can stay and get deep into the kind of the spiritual hinterland of the person and things like that? And
That's exactly, that's why this is a novel and not a non-fiction, because you write a non-fiction about a private all-girls school and about, kids growing up in Braybrook, people will consider a tract, a political statement saying, oh, you're trying to say something, or you're putting forth an agenda. But when you put it in a novel, the great Bangladeshi poet Tagore said that truth in her dress finds facts too tight. In fiction, she moves with ease. You can say greater truths in fiction than you can say in non-fiction, because people always assume you have an ulterior motive in non-fiction.
And Victor Surgeon, I quoted this back to Helen Garner when she was here just before I went away. He said, writing should be a testimony to the vast flow of life through us.
It's true.
Yeah?
Yes.
Do you feel that life kind of rushes through you at quite a pace, do you?
When I write, I feel it does.
Do you?
Yeah, you get to sit down and think about the deep questions that you don't when you're just living day-to-day life. You're just trying to keep your head above water.
Okay. And I think of people like my parents who were illiterate and who never went near books. And I'm not trying to say that you're making a case for why literature humanises us, but for the people who don't have literature and that, where do you think, how do we tell those stories, and how do we get a sense of the way they make meaning when they don't have access to the ways that we kind of find meaning and make meaning?
Oh, well, they have all sorts of ways. They, in some ways, some people who, don't have literacy probably see the world clearer, and their world is not blocked by words that our world is. So they see things more literally, they see things more carefully, I think. and I speak from personal experience and familial experience too.
And you're thinking of your mother too,
Yeah,
in some of the ways that she reads the world without her education and things like that. I often think of myself when I'm reading and the acuteness of the intensity I feel of life, but then I get to the point where I want to put the book down and I want to go to the sea, and that's about getting away from words too, and writing tires me and reading tires me. Do you feel like that too sometimes, that with all the words?
Yes.
Like Milosh says, I have read many books, but I don't believe them. When it hurts, we return to the banks of certain rivers. Do you think he's right about that?
Oh, he's spot on. He's spot on. And there was another writer, I can't remember who it was, that said a desktop is a really dangerous place from which to see the world. And if you become one of those, writers who just stay at their desktop and, what do you call it, barter in ideas, you can see sometimes it gets really petty. You have wars with different writers, So you need to get out into the world.
So what does Alice Pung do to get away from that and to make sure that she's not desk-bound?
Oh, well, I do my day job. I spend weekends walking with Nick. I visit schools. So writing isn't everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could you please thank the polished gem herself, Alice Pung?
Thank you.